It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this panel discussion entitled Building Resilient Systems to Support International Students in Canada. We're going to hear 4 exciting presentations about the experiences of international students in Canada. But before we get to them, let me do some housekeeping. First and foremost, I want to remind all of you that there is a Q&A button on your screen. Please use it to submit questions. We're going to hold the questions until the end of the discussion. We're leaving about 15 minutes for discussion at the end, and I will be very strict with the speakers, so you have it. The reason for that is then we can try and consolidate the questions, but please feel free to send questions as you think about them. The second thing is that the recording of this session and the PowerPoint will be available in a few days on the P2P website. And finally, I may introduce questions of clarification if they are minor at the end of a presentation. So we have 4 speakers today, and I'm going to introduce them now very briefly in the order in which they're going to speak. We're going to start with Dr. Martin Walton Roberts, who is a professor of geography at Wilfrid Laurier University. Then Dr. Shatama Ghosh, who is an associate professor of geography at Ryerson University, will speak. Then thirdly, Dr. Francine Schlosser from the Odette School of Business at the University of Windsor. And finally, to finish up, Dr. Louisa Veronis from the University of Ottawa. Now, they have each promised me they will take only about 13 minutes. So without more ado, I want to begin with Professor Walton Roberts.
Great. Thank you, Valerie, and thank you to P2P for this opportunity to present on our work on resilience and international students. I'll start the presentations off, and I'll be talking about Indian international students in Canada, thinking about migration trajectories, educational experience, and economic outcomes, but we'll be thinking about it through the lens of resilience. So the Building Migrant Resilience in Cities project explores resilience in a broad sense. And so resilience is partly about how individuals manage and develop capacities to overcome various challenges. And in the case of the immigrant community, we're particularly interested in settlement challenges, but we also pay attention to different views of resilience that are shared by key actors in settlements, such as policymakers, service providers, employers, and migrants. We also argue that we need a deeper understanding of resilience in order to also apply it to institutions. And we want to think about this through the lens of the systems that contribute to settlement of immigrants. And so in this webinar, we're looking at this in terms of international students. Certainly, immigrants develop strategies and resources to help them deal with the various challenges. But as we argue, we also need to think about policies and institutions and how they respond. And so in the case of international students, we're particularly interested in how resilience can play a role in terms of this particular population. In many cases, they face challenges in the absence of their family networks and important support networks, but they also face the complicated challenge of moving along multiple parallel pathways. So typically they come as students, then they convert into postgraduate work permit, then at some point they may attempt to become permanent residents. And this creates a very different type of migration experience and trajectory. And so we're interested in those issues. And in light of that, we're also interested in the policy structures that contribute to this experience. So I'll begin by just talking about international students in Canada. As of last year, the year before last, 2019, there were about 642,000 international students in Canada. And India was the top sending country for that year. So about 34% of those international students were from India. So clearly this is an important country to understand in terms of its relationship with Canada, but particularly its contribution to international student migration flows. Now, by understanding what's happening with international students in Canada, it's interesting to consider the subjects that are studied. This is relevant, of course, to what's happening in the universities and colleges, but it's also important in terms of understanding potential labour market attachment with these international students. So looking at data on subject areas studied, this is looking at 2009 to 2020. I've highlighted here the numbers for all students and then drawn out the number for India in the number as well as the percentage. And I just want to highlight some of the top subjects studied by international students. So this includes business management, marketing and related support services. It computing and IT. Also looking at health sciences is another area where international students from India are concentrated. And this is quite important, especially with the recent report coming from Statistics Canada with regards to the performance of international students by subject area. And so this is something I'll comment on in a moment. Now, the other thing that happens that's of relevance to us as we think about the experiences of international students, looking at it from a system perspective, is how do international students transfer into permanent residence? So they come out of their study permit, often automatically they get an opportunity at an experience. Sorry, my son just came home from school. Excuse me, be quiet. Sorry. So many times they will go into permanent residency through the express entry pathway. And so what's interesting here is when we look at express entry, we see that those subject areas in terms of IT and business and financial service are often the top performers. Interestingly as well, looking at data on the express entry system, we see that the top countries of residence are Canada, so those are folks already in Canada, or India. And then when we look at those who enter through express entry in terms of their citizenship, again, we see the dominance of India. So India is a really important country for us to understand in terms of the way in which the system, both in the international student and the express entry pathways, operates in terms of this population. The important things about highlighting this from a sort of systems perspective is to identify that international students from India are concentrated in subject areas that are in demand if we understand this through the express entry lens. And therefore, we could assume that the rewards they gain are going to be better because they will hopefully experience better labour market integration, better job matching, better levels of income, and they could also address regional labour shortages. Now, one probably needs to kind of continue to investigate this because, as I mentioned, that the recent Stats Canada, the report that came out, indicated that in some areas of business management, income earnings of international students compared to Canadian and permanent resident students are less in the first year of graduation and don't necessarily catch up over 5 years. There are also risks in terms of the system that has been created, which is that we are bringing in large numbers of international students who have a temporary migrant visa, and the numbers that come in are considered privatized and uncapped. So it's really a demand from colleges that is satisfied by IRCC. But when those individual students want to move into permanent residence, that system through express entry is typically more capped. And so we might have this instability from a system perspective as these two kind of flows, as these two processes come together. So what we need to consider then is how resilience at the level of the system might be either undermined or enhanced by the way in which these individuals who come into the system are able to move through it in a more seamless and efficient manner. And we also need to pay attention to the geographical and occupational concentrations that might be occurring in the inflows of international students. And so this is something that will really require ongoing monitoring and analysis. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Now, I want to remind everybody, please put your questions in the question and answer box. I have many questions, but before I put them there, I'll look forward to hearing from the rest of you. Now, our next speaker is Dr. Shutama Ghosh from Ryerson University. Shutama?
Thank you so much, Valerie, and thank you, Margaret, for giving me the opportunity to actually present this research. So what I'm going to report on is our investigation on the assemblages of Indian international students in GTA colleges. Please, to the next slide, please. What I'm going to talk about is that, first of all, I want to tell you a little bit about why should we study colleges? Why is it important? As we have just seen that, of course, I'm not going to talk about why Indian students are important. You've understood that pretty well, in the last presentation. So even though about 85,000 international students are enrolled in colleges, there are very few studies that actually focus on this cohort. The reason why this cohort is important, because 1 in 4 international students attend colleges, and 85% of all those Indian students that are coming to Canada are enrolled in colleges. So there is an overwhelming percentage of, or proportion of, Indian students going to colleges. Why are they doing that? So if you go to the next slide, the 2 questions that came to mind is that why are they in colleges and what kinds of colleges? So before going to that, let me just explain to you that for many people, the Canadian post-secondary system is simple, but the reality is that in actuality, it is not the case. The Canadian post-secondary system is extremely complicated. There are universities, there are colleges. Most universities are government funded like Ryerson, but there are also private universities. And within colleges, what is more interesting is that even though there are community colleges which are government funded, and there are 5 of those in the GTA, like George Brown, Centennial, Sheridan, Seneca, and Humber, there are, however, about 440 private career colleges, and these are all over Ontario. We don't have the exact number for the GTA because these keep fluctuating, and also the designated learning institutes, if you go through them, it's difficult to know which one is where. So one of these photographs that you see on the right hand side of your screen, the Academy of Learning Career College, there are numerous such career colleges that you will find throughout the GTA, particularly in strip malls or plazas like such. Now, the differences between community and private career colleges are also pertaining to international tuition fees. So while to go to a community college, you need 14,000 Canadian per term for 1 term, and typically you have to go for 4 terms. For a diploma from a private career college, you spend altogether about 9,000 to 10,000 Canadian dollars. The admission requirements, particularly with respect to English language skills, we found that even though it is mandatory to get into a community college, you need to pass, get a 6 score actually on test of English as foreign language. In order to go into a private career colleges, there is no such stipulation. In fact, sometimes to get into a private career colleges, the English requirement requirements may be waived. To give you an example of private career colleges, this could be truck driving colleges, esthetician colleges, culinary colleges, and so on and so forth, which are again often run and operated by immigrants themselves. Last but not the least, the permitted work hour and regulations. We found that although it is stipulated that you can work 20 hours per week, but it is more regulated under the community college system compared to private college systems. So if you know about the truck driver who was actually caught on the 401 highway coming from Montreal to Toronto, he was going through a truck driving school, and he did not even know that he could not work more than 20 hours. Finally, as Margaret has already alluded to this, that the value of diploma and how it is linked to employment opportunities is a very important point. You might know about the National Occupation List, which is published by the Government of Canada and clearly shows a 3-tier system. So if you come from a university, you are most likely to get level 1 jobs. If you come from a college and have a college diploma or a degree, some colleges also give degrees, you can get level 2 jobs. And if you come from a private career college or from a college where you are or you have learned about that skill on the job, then you can expect to get level 3. So the question is, if this is already in the in the public domain, why are so many students going for colleges, first of all, colleges and not universities? And secondly, again, why are so many people going to private career colleges? The next slide, please. So we had two, actually sort of three interrelated questions. Why are Indian students, so many of them, going to GTA colleges? What is their specific profile? And is there a specific profile for who goes to what kind of college? And then what are the pathways of choosing those institutions? So thanks to BMRC, who funded this research, we were able to do some fieldwork in India, but however, most of the fieldwork was done in the GTA. But through the fieldwork in India and the GTA, we found some very interesting connections, which I want to speak to you briefly, but I'm happy to come back to that later on. Let's talk about what we found. So next. So following the systems approach, we've basically found that, as you can see, there are numerous arrows going in different directions, and they show messy. And this is exactly how the system is. It is messy. So we chose to show that the messiness of the situation by showing you that the width of the arrows basically show what is the main type of communication that is going on. So without complicating your mind too much, I'm going to talk about three issues. First, the responsibility of the federal government. What does the federal government do? The federal government essentially has a target of how many international students they want. Secondly, the federal government also sanctions those visas. So they are the ones who are, in a way, gatekeeping. And if you saw, you learned from Margaret's presentation that Indian students are one of the highest who get these visas. However, if you look at the federal government webpage, it clearly says that it is aware that there are education agents, who we are going to talk about in a minute, who are responsible for recruiting most of the students, but it clearly says use these students at your own risk. In other words, it knows about the education agents, but it does not want to do anything about them. It does not want to moderate their work or activities as such. So this is really problematic, given that even though they benefit from tuition fees, living expenses, and labor contributions, the federal government, of course, unsurprisingly, has a neoliberal attitude of staying out of it, the business. Next, I'm going to talk to you about education agents. You see that in level 2. So you see education agents in Canada. This is an important issue because this has never been studied. Although it is studied in other countries. So what we are seeing is that community colleges exclusively use education agents to recruit, but private career colleges do not. So we see that private career colleges, you see this huge black line that comes to that student sitting at the bottom. So private career colleges can actually directly recruit, but education agents in Canada are hired primarily by community colleges, who then go and hire education agents in India. So there is a transnational collaboration going on. Furthermore, there is another group, which again has not been studied in Canada or reported so far, is the influence of the edu brokers. The work of the edu brokers are multinational corporations, German corporations, British corporations, who actually hold these edu expos in India. I I have attended those. And in those, basically in those expos, there are also banks and private lenders. So in other words, there is a systems approach to target which student will go where. Interestingly, in all our interviews, we found that most of the students did not even know about universities when they were applying. They were only said, oh, there is not much difference between universities and colleges. And many of them came to Canada and realized this whole issue of the university being different from colleges. Last but not the least, as has been reported elsewhere, misrepresentation, steering, fraud, financial frauds were very commonly experienced by students. Let me go to the last slide before I conclude. And so what we found in our study is that there is a structure at structural level, at the group level, and at the individual level. There were numerous factors working toward, how these people were coming. So I will end by talking to you a little bit about what we found. Even though our sample size is so small, we found that most of the people who were coming to community colleges were coming from metropolitan areas, especially the national capital region. So this map of India, and on top you see the national capital region of Delhi. And that area is an extremely urban area with most students speaking in English and English educated. The reason why they came is because they said that they basically came in order to avoid some of the competition and also earn Canadian dollars and go back home or send remittances home. But what is most interesting is that among the private career colleges, we saw overwhelming proportion coming from the Punjab, especially the Malwa region of Punjab, which in the recent past has undergone tremendous agrarian crises, particularly because of contract farming. And these people are in fact have sold their farms in order to make money so that they could send their children over to Canada. So the foreign dreams, what's driving the exodus of youth from Punjab. This has been reported again and again in the media in India in particular, but not so much in Canada. I'll end up talking a little bit about resilience. So what do they do when they come here and they realize that the education agents have caused all these problems and etc. What our study shows that because of the nature of power being so decentralized, it is very hard for these students to actually hold somebody responsible. Why didn't they know about the universities? Why weren't they told about the differences between private career and community colleges? Why, when they came here, the private career college could even shut down, and what to do next? They had nobody to go to, and only rely again on their own social networks. So this is what we have found so far. The study is not, of course, complete. It is still ongoing, and hopefully we'll be able to report more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shutama. That's a pretty damning set of findings. I'm looking forward to the discussion about it. And again, more questions and answers. We are going to have plenty of time for discussion. So our next speaker is Dr. Francine Schlosser. Francine?
Thanks a lot, Valerie. It's a great pleasure to speak to you all today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some research that I've done with colleagues at ODAT School of Business, Dr. Jerry Kerr and Duncan Lamb. And we've looked specifically at a group of international students that we would classify as edu-immigrants. So if you can go to that's great, thank you. So as Shutama was already saying, we have 642,000 international students who studied in Canada in 2019. And of those students, 60% of them plan to apply for permanent residency in Canada, and 75% sought post-graduation work placements. These are the types of students that we are talking about when we're talking about edu-immigrants. They basically come to Canada to study with premeditated goals of securing employment and settling down in Canada. In international students, of course, we've seen this gigantic increase over the past 10 years. It's, I think the last numbers I've got is 154% increase from 2010 to 2018. And we've been using this to build some of our immigration pathways. We do have some competition in the world. Certainly, the US has limited its pathways to immigration for international students, but New Zealand and Australia have actually increased them. And Europe, of course, relies quite a lot on Erasmus exchanges to attract international students who are going to immigrate to specific countries. But regardless, many countries, Western countries in the world, consider international education to be a pathway to permanence, and likewise, the students themselves consider it a way to move somewhere else. Can you switch a slide, please? So our research then wanted to look at the experience of edu-immigrants coping with new social, political, and environmental structures, and how they might integrate into their adopted country's labor market and society. We looked at how regional and community stakeholders such as post-secondary institutions, settlement agencies, and local businesses might be able to support edu-immigrant resilience. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a complicated conceptual diagram, but I thought it would still help to kind of lay out where edu-immigrants fit in the whole ecosystem of immigration support. So on the left, you have a circle that talks about international students and the relationship with other stakeholders, and then elements of the intelligent career, which I've been using to, if you manage your career intelligently, that means you are moving forward with knowing how, knowing why, and knowing whom to actually meet your goals. So it introduces these 3 central career competencies, and individuals can respond to opportunities in a competency-driven employment environment by developing, this knowing why, which is why we work, our motivation, our values and identity. The second one is how we work, our application of skills and knowledge. And the third one is with whom we work, our relationships, reputations, and career supports. And this was developed, this framework by Arthur Clement and De Filippi about 25 years ago. And it's been used as the basis for boundaryless career research as well, where we look at the growing mobility of knowledge workers and how they view their careers as they're kind of moving around the spectrum. So part of our study's focus was on the regional stakeholders. So as we look at the relationship between international students and edu-immigrants and skilled migrants with the local community and other supports within our community, I started to use the Friedman and Miles stakeholder model to help kind of classify their relationship with stakeholders. So for instance, a post-secondary institution would consider international students to be necessary, compatible stakeholders, and in a very explicitly recognized relationship that was very strictly defined as that between educator and student. But in comparison, other regional actors, such as like settlement agencies and local businesses, regard international students as contingent compatible, which means they're in an implicit, unrecognized relationship. So the ones that would consider a skilled migrant would be settlement agencies. They would consider them necessary compatible because there is a specific relationship between skilled migrants and settlement agencies. But in the case of edu-immigrants, who kind of span both international student and skilled migrant in the nature of their needs and goals, the relationship with all the regional stakeholders, including post-secondary institutions, was purely contingent compatible. And that means there really is nothing explicit. And, it's easy to say, well, someone else should take care of them, but nobody actually has responsibility for them. So that, again, prompted even more of our, of our interest in this class of migrants, and it really shows the ambiguity of their position. Next slide. So our study included interviews with 13 post-secondary and settlement and actually regional economic organizational stakeholders. And then we surveyed 374 international students. And we did have some open-ended questions for the international students, which provided a little bit more knowledge about where they were really at. And we looked specifically then at the knowing who, knowing how, knowing why type of parameters in order to determine how resilient they are, where the resilience is lacking and needs some support. So I see that there's a question there from Haniatan Al-Ubaidi. I can give you some examples of where we went with this. So for instance, the knowing why, which is clearly known by most of the students. You know, they're obviously traversing half the world. So they're coming here and they do know why, but sometimes that know why doesn't translate so well into resilience. So for instance, the motivation for migration. We had one quote that said, "I intend to pass my certified accounting exams and find work in a firm." Whereas another person said, "The door of better job opportunities will open for me." So how does that work with resiliency? Well, identifying clear goals and being optimistic both build resilience and the motivation to migrate. But being able to articulate a goal will add persistence to optimism and create a stronger resilience. When we look at the knowing how part of it, for instance, part of knowing how their career competency would be related to foreign credentials and experience. And so we had one person who said, "I have experience as a CAD designer in one of the reputable car makers. I'm expecting that this experience would help me to get a job in a similar field here in Canada." And so, yes, that had an effect on resiliency because not only is it a transferable skill, but this person also showed the understanding of how to use the skills and provide the basis for starting to develop resilience in Canada. And then the knowing whom part, the knowing whom is the third part of it. For example, one of the issues would be developing work and non-work related local social capital. And social capital is really just those resources that you can call upon and turn into value for yourself, basically capitalize on. So a representative quote was, "I volunteer in church in the children's department as an activity coordinator." And another one said, "I receive food items from my church on a weekly basis. I work part-time during the school year and full-time during the holidays." And both of those examples show how local social capital was being developed by pursuing access to faith-based mentors. And that access created opportunities for work engagement as well as for basic necessities and helped to build their resilience. You know, even finding higher status local connections. We had one person say, "I keep searching and applying to part-time engineering jobs through websites suggested by career development and experiential learning workshops." But you know, there wasn't enough academic career advising, and that created a risk for that particular student because they could not make a higher status local connection. So, there was another, there are a whole bunch of different quotes that I could share with you, but that's how our mind was making those connections. So basically then this research uncovered issues that you see in front of you, having clear educational and career goals was an issue that was, it wasn't really an issue because they have clear educational and career goals coming out of this, and that certainly helped to build resilience. And most of the edu-immigrants knew why and how to enhance their skills and their competencies. But the biggest hole was where they didn't know whom to turn to for help in acquiring social connections. And those are very important to access the spectrum of work experiences. It's difficult for edu-immigrants to develop higher level social capital and contacts without the support of campus and external stakeholders. And when students were not able to find help on campus, 60% sought help off campus. But really, this was a very difficult thing for them, and sometimes they weren't actually in the qualified part of the services that settlement agencies could provide. Next slide, please. So the service gaps then, really, it goes back to that diagram where, you know, you're looking at the different circles. Well, settlement agencies don't receive funding to support international students and edu-immigrants. And the new ideas for more settlement support were not viewed as core to the educational mission of post-secondary institutions. So these edu-immigrants were falling through the cracks. And there was a very recent study that was done by StatsCan and IRCC that came out, and they were also talking about the fact that post-graduation international students face lower earnings. And part of that would be due to a lack of pre-graduation experience. And certainly for the 5 years following graduation, there was definitely a hit and a difference between international students and their domestic counterparts. And in fact, 43.6% of international students had no Canadian work experience prior to graduation. So this became a real issue in how they would be able to stay resilient in those critical years after they graduate. And if you could switch slides, please. So our solution is clear. It's called cross-institutional collaboration. So post-secondary institutions can help edu-immigrants by focusing on nurturing those 3 types of knowing, ensuring they know their goals, aiding in the creation of the skills needed for lasting careers, and facilitating the establishment of a career-relevant social and professional network. And this, and I know as an educator, this was not part of how post-secondary institutions saw their role with international students. I've been teaching for more than 20 years, and there was a lack of appreciation that the students actually wanted to stay in Canada. There was a lack of preparation for them because there's this feeling of accountability. You need to send the brain back to where they came from, or else you're draining that developing country. But now I think they're starting to understand that we need to be providing them with the same career experiences that we provide to our domestic students as a matter of just going forward. We also need to see more cross-institutional collaboration among educational institutions, religious institutions, settlement agencies, and business members to provide and fund necessary services and develop new programs. The disadvantages that were faced by international students in securing pre-grad work experience were noted in that StatsCan and IRCC report that I mentioned from 2021. And they note the issues with language, culture differences. Sometimes it might be the field of study, sometimes it's course grades, and sometimes it's employer reluctance to just recruit and train international students when they only have temporary status. And sometimes there's some discrimination. So it's very incumbent on post-secondary institutions and partners to work with international students and employers to mitigate these issues and to develop more resilience. Thank you.
Now, there are more questions and comments. Please put them in the box. I think we're going to have an interesting discussion. And our last speaker in the formal part of this session is Dr. Louisa Varonis from the University of Ottawa. Louisa?
Hello, thank you everyone. Thank you, Valerie, and thank you to my 3 colleagues for setting the stage. And I'm very honored to be part of this P2P workshop, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So in this presentation, I would like to go back to what Margaret discussed in terms of taking a systems approach to resilience. And I would like to complicate, or at least my main objective is to argue that we need to further complicate or take a step back and look at these issues of resilience differently by taking into account language a lot more seriously. So the 3 presentations before me actually do show how complicated the story is, and they didn't even include issues of language. So Canada trying to be a bilingual country, and given recent debates around Canada's official language policy, if you could imagine that everything that was said and how complicated it is, it's equally complicated, but differently complicated if you look at Francophone issues, Francophone communities, and Francophone international students who may be coming to Canada outside of Quebec, so in a minority context. Next slide, please. So if we really want to consider issues of resilience from a systems perspective, I would like to argue that we also need to take language more seriously and look at the question of international students, not only from an immigration policy perspective, but also take into account Canada's official language policy. Right now, in the study of immigration in Canada, the only connection between language and immigration is made in the study of Francophone minority communities and trying to stimulate Francophone immigrants to settle outside of Quebec and contribute to the vitality of Francophone communities. There has been little interest or consideration on international students who may be Francophone, and or also the fact that there are post-secondary French or Francophone institutions outside of Quebec, and their reliance on international students, or the significance of these international students for the resilience of the universities, as well as the Francophone communities that they serve. Now, Shutama earlier spoke of the complexity of the post-secondary ecology or ecosystem. There's also complexity in Canada's universities in the sense that some universities are bilingual, as is the case of the University of Ottawa or Laurentian University. There are also Francophone post-secondary institutions outside of Quebec, like Saint-Boniface or Campus Saint-Jean in Alberta. And you may be aware that these smaller universities that are Francophone are suffering from financial struggles, as you may be aware more recently with Laurentian University. Next slide, please. So what stimulated me to think more about this is because our study at the University of Ottawa is looking at Francophone or French-speaking and English-speaking students. But within the Francophone communities, there's a lot of discussion around resilience as well. So this is a long quote that I took from a very recently sent message from the Vice President International Francophonie at the University of Ottawa, my colleague Sani Yaya, and in bold, that's the sentence that really drew my attention and actually motivated me to discuss this, where he spoke, as March is the month of the Francophonie. He launched this month at the University of Ottawa by saying the recent upheavals in French language post-secondary education, referring, among other things, to Laurentian University. So these upheavals in Ontario demonstrate more than ever that the Franco-Ontarian community must show resilience. And it's this resilience of the Franco-Ontarian community, but also of other Francophone minorities, and especially Francophone students outside of Quebec, and their access to post-secondary university in their own languages. So next slide. So I'd like us to think a little bit about the complexity of language in the study of international students and sort of broader issues of resilience of universities and different types of universities, the resilience of international students, but also of the communities where they go, and more broadly, Canada, our economic stability, our demographic vitality, and so on. The University of Ottawa is the largest English-French bilingual university in the world. Now, how does this work? It's quite complicated. The university itself provides all non-academic services in both languages. When it comes to the academic programs, there is a lot of diversity, with some programs being mostly in French or mostly in English, or actually being bilingual. But the language landscape of the universities is very, very complex. The other thing it's important to note is that the French-speaking or the Francophone part is slightly smaller than the English-speaking, and it's not doing as well. Now, the University of Ottawa is pursuing a dual mandate, both to internationalize, but also to maintain and promote bilingualism, and it's doing this in tandem. So the graph that you can see here shows or illustrate how the efforts of internationalization have paid off at the University of Ottawa. And the four different bars: English-speaking undergraduate, French-speaking undergraduate, English-speaking graduate, and French-speaking graduate. So clearly you can see that the English-speaking, particularly at the undergraduate level, are doing quite well. What the university did in 2014, it introduced a special tuition fee rebate for international students studying in French. And you can see how starting in 2015, immediately, especially on the undergraduate side, this policy paid off in terms of attracting more French-speaking international students. Next slide. The focus of our study is in trying to understand the experiences of graduate students who are French-speaking or English-speaking international graduate students. So we're not looking at undergraduate, we focus on graduate students because our assumption was that more of them may want to stay in Canada as permanent residents. Now, the other component that influenced our study is that the context of the University of Ottawa is bilingualism. The region of Ottawa-Gatineau is also highly bilingual, and we decided to interview students from diverse backgrounds, so we didn't focus on specific regions or countries of origin. And this is to break away from most current research, which tends to focus on specific groups of students, specifically Chinese and Indian, as my colleagues suggested earlier. So we were able to interview 19 participants, 13 who had English as their first official language, and 6 who had French. Among the French-speaking students, generally, they were pretty much bilingual. They were comfortable speaking in English. But among the English-speaking participants, very few of them knew French, and many of them weren't quite aware the University of Ottawa was bilingual, that the region was bilingual, and therefore their experiences were very varied depending on where they were from. And we looked at their experiences of bilingualism with regard to their academic program, their social networks on campus and off campus, employment, and so on. So next slide. Briefly, I wanted to illustrate the diversity of experiences, among other things, because international students' language capital varied significantly, especially between the French-speaking and the English-speaking, but their experiences varied not only depending on whether they were French-speaking or English-speaking, but also depending on their field of study and depending on what area of their lives we were looking at. In terms of academics, most of the English-speaking students were enrolled in English language programs. So they didn't have a lot of issues generally, except for one student who had enrolled in a bilingual program and wasn't aware of it until after he arrived here, and he suddenly found out he had to learn French and complete one of his courses in French. But on the Francophone side, English for academics wasn't an issue. The issue was that the majority of them couldn't complete their coursework in French, and something that is common at the University of Ottawa, French-speaking students need to fill their courses in English because there isn't enough courses in French. More interesting issues arose with regard to employment. Now, on campus, all of the services are bilingual. So English-speaking students were in a situation where they had very few opportunities to become employed on campus because they didn't have the bilingual requirement. This was not an issue for the French-speaking students because the majority was fluent enough in English. And some of our participants who spoke other languages than English and French said they felt the bilingualism was somewhat a token because the other languages weren't necessarily valued. Now, off-campus employment was also an interesting situation. And again, the English-speaking students experienced more barriers because they weren't meeting the bilingual requirements of the labor market in Ottawa, particularly in the service sector. So one participant told us, I'm a PhD student studying these grand philosophical theories, but I can't get basic employment in retail because I'm not bilingual. And he felt it was ridiculous. But in terms of occupation, those students who were studying in STEM told us that actually bilingualism was not an issue because in the STEM field, English was the main language. Nevertheless, all of our participants generally felt that the bilingualism contributed to making campus very open, diverse, and tolerant because everyone was confronted with the issue of having to learn another language. And there was a lot of patience and openness, and generally was a very welcoming because of this extreme diversity where language contributed even more to difference. Next slide. So these were more to illustrate the variety of different types of resiliences that were tied on the one hand to international students as individuals, and how in fact language, and depending on what their first language was, but also their linguistic capital in English, in French, and in bilingualism led to very diverse experiences in terms of their academic program, their employment experience, and particularly the employment part was significant because of the financial needs that the students have, and then the experience of being in a bilingual context that was quite new to them. But I also want to raise issues around the resilience of post-secondary institutions, particularly those who are bilingual or francophone, and their ability to attract and support international students with their diverse linguistic capital, and the fact that the need of francophone post-secondary institutions to be able to attract international students have been somewhat overlooked, and now it's coming to the fore with the impacts of COVID. Now, in addition, I would like also to raise the question of the resilience of Francophone communities and how Francophone international students has been overlooked as a potential source to maintain both the vitality of the communities, but also to guarantee the maintenance of their post-secondary institutions, among other things. So overall, we can even step back and broaden to consider for Canada as a bilingual country, the need to include the question of language when we study international students and their role, as well as the challenges they face, particularly depending on their occupation or the regional context and the language requirements associated, particularly working off campus. So here I wanted to make the case for including the language in a more systematic fashion and conduct studies across Canada that take into account the role of language. For example, one of the earlier graphs that Margaret showed around occupation, I wonder whether Francophone international students may be selecting different types of occupations depending on where they're coming from or where in Canada they are studying. So I think there's a whole new ground there to examine further. Thank you very much.